whip through a bunch of these because you've heard a lot of this from other people, but this is the middle class trend that you've heard from everybody. The implications of basically China and India and Brazil in terms of their standard of living, it's very simple implication for us in the United States. The cost of seafood is going to increase. And we are currently, and this is something which most people don't know, seafood has exceeded the consumer price index for the last 18 years in the United States. We are the most expensive protein in the marketplace. So when you talk about what can we do to expand aquaculture, what can we do to be competitive, our issue is price. That is our issue. And we see that in the marketplace all the time, not just competing with low-cost producers from other countries, but competing with poultry, beef, some of the other protein sources which are out there. Food production must double. You've seen this before. I think, the general public in this country does not really understand, I think, where we are headed from a food production point of view. They don't understand the limitations on the resources that we are facing, in particular freshwater and some of our essential nutrients, phosphorus, for example. How many people know when the existing reserves of phosphorus that have been mapped on the world are projected to run out of current use capacity?
50 years.
That's right. So in 50 years, we will, based on what we know in terms of our current phosphorus reserves, we will have, unless we find new ones, we will not have phosphorus at the levels that we're currently using in terrestrial agriculture. What percentage of aquifers do people think are being pumped over recharge rates in the world? Take a
Probably
guess.
100.
It's 87%. So that's every 2 years I go to a meeting in Lucerne, Switzerland of a bunch of agronomists. That's part of my background is agronomy. And we have been doing this for now 15 years, 16 years. We sit down and we have folks come in and map basic resource use patterns and basic resources in the world. And we track 14 different natural resources. Arable land, phosphorus levels, fresh water, basic stuff like that. There is a fundamental change which is happening in food production economies that most people, even in agriculture, aren't aware of at this stage of the game. And that is the shift is going from, it used to be that countries that needed stuff would go on the international market and they would buy commodities. You'd buy soybeans, you'd buy corn, you might dabble in futures, you might hedge your bets. That is shifting. People are buying the means of production. Who is the largest buyer of water rights on the west coast of the United States and Canada?
China.
China. Who's the largest buyer of prime agricultural land in the United States in the last 3 years? Land. China.
Wow. They're buying Africa.
They are buying Africa, that's right. So if I want to leave you with one thing today, I want to leave you with the message that what we do with aquaculture and what is happening in food, this is a national security issue. This is a national interest issue. This is not just about markets and prices and whatever. This is about what we as a country and what our kids, I have 2 kids, they're both in college, they're bankrupting me. I'm looking where they're going to go, how they're going to make a living, what their cost of living is going to be. This is not going to happen 100 years from now. This is going to happen in their lifetime. And so it is, I think, a pivotal point in both our country's history, the world's history, but also in what we as aquaculture professionals can do to make a difference. We have an opportunity which I think is very unusual, and if we don't do it right, which I would contend is the way we've been doing it for the last 50 years, we will leave a legacy to our country which will be very difficult to get out of. And this is a guy that I, at one point in my career, did a period of work with Lester Brown. He founded something called the World Watch Institute. He's now at a different place. But essentially, Lester is one of those thinkers in the world that tracks resources, looks at what the possibilities are, tries to project them out. And he's saying very simply that we are about to enter a whole different period in terms of food and scarcity and resource use, both globally and in the United States. And one of the things that he's tracked is the cost of food. We're used to pretty cheap or reasonably priced food. That's going to change, and that's going to change in our kids' lifetimes. It's already changing now. The way that's impacting seafood in particular is in two ways. One is the cost of energy of moving seafood around has changed some of the economics between imports and exports, and between domestic production and imports. That's a good thing for us in domestic aquaculture. The cost of moving seafood in particular has gotten quite expensive. It costs my competitors from Chile 75 cents a pound to put a fillet on the ground in Miami. They then have to pay for trucking beyond that. I can put a pound of salmon in a truck, and in 24 hours I can hit 150 million consumers from Chicago east and Atlanta north. That gives me a big price advantage in the marketplace just based on transportation, not only on a cost of production. Another thing I think that we're often missing here is that we actually are producing currently, if you exclude seafood for a moment, if you look at the amount of surface area of the globe, which is land, and then you look at the amount of that, which is arable land, we're feeding the world on 7.5% of the world's surface area. That's a relatively small area. But 75% of the world is water. And in fact, if you go back and look at where does food come from, it comes from solar radiation. It comes from, ultimately, the sun and photosynthesis. Well, 75% of the world is being hit by solar radiation, which we are not farming. We are not taking advantage of that. That is an enormous possibility. And I think we have to start talking about that from an aquaculture professional point of view to the general public. We have to start talking about why it's good to farm in water and what the differences in efficiencies are. I think you've heard some of this today. I use this slide often when I'm talking to chefs or consumers, but there are some fundamental efficiencies that are to do with growing food in water versus growing food on land that most people don't understand. Most people don't understand why it would be more efficient to grow in water. And that's true for the plants as well as the animals. And we have the honor, I guess, of having the only commercial kelp farm in the United States in Maine. They are growing by leaps and bounds. They just signed a $25 million contract with Whole Foods for one product line out of their product lines. The aquatic plant side of aquaculture has been grossly underexplored in the U.S. It is an area where I think we have enormous potential, and we need to do more. Remember that on a worldwide production basis, over half of aquaculture production is aquatic plants, okay, in terms of tonnage. So it's about space and resources, and I use this slide very often in public presentations as well, and I really believe this. I believe that within a relatively short period of time, not geological time, but human time, within 100, 200 years, we will be producing much more food in water than we will on land, just because of the underlying fundamentals in terms of energetics and efficiencies. I'm not going to beat this into the ground, but I want to just make one point. We are very early on in the emergence of aquaculture. There is a very predictable transition that happens. It happened on land. It's happening now in water, and we're seeing the emergence of sustainable ways of farming in water that will take us a long time to develop. We're developing it at a relatively rapid pace. We've only been really commercially farming in water for about 100 to 200 years. We've been doing it, for 2,000 years, depending on whose archaeological evidence you believe. But the point is, there is this progression where you start by kind of capturing and holding wild animals or plants, and you begin to domesticate them over time. How many species do we grow on land? Roughly. 5 to 10 species. How many species are we currently culturing in aquatic environments around the world?
300.
650 according to the FAO. So Now, why did we end up with the species that we grow on land?
Because we domesticated them early on.
They do well. They're amenable to domestication and captive rearing. We are very early on in the process in the aquatic world to do that. So we have some species that we grow now. Will they be the species that we end up growing commercially 100 years from now? Probably some of them will. A lot of them won't. And we are going down a lot of blind alleys. And I guess the second lesson, or the second point I want to leave you with today is, yes, it's in our national interest, but it's also, we have to make some hard choices because of the limited resources that Jeff was talking about. We have to make some choices to do with what species we think are the most promising for the U.S. and what technologies make the most sense. And one of the things we have to stop doing is letting technology be a band-aid for picking species that don't actually do well in domestication. We have, in the United States in particular, we have focused greatly on the technology side of things, and we have lost sight, in my mind, of the fact that, particularly with animals, it's about husbandry and domestication, and which of those species do well in captivity and which don't. And I will tell you, we are in for some surprises. At one point in my career, I did a lot of work with bluefin tuna. The first thing that people said to me is, that's an open ocean animal, you're never going to domesticate it, you're never going to that animal will not lend itself to farming. Well, we farm wild juveniles up to market size. Those animals turn into puppy dogs. I mean, you could reach out and pet them. We never would have predicted that, looking at the ecology of that animal before we started to work with it. So I think it's difficult to predict what is going to be a successful species or not, but there are some fundamental characteristics that you can go down through species and pick those characteristics that will work with those species. This is an old projection, but obviously this was a projection that was made, I think, in 2004. We're already almost there. So we're ahead of what the projections are saying in terms of the role that aquaculture is going to play. And this is, I think, one of the big game changers. A couple of people have talked to this earlier today, but this is the biggest one. In 2010, China flipped from being a net exporter to a net importer. A very near dear friend of mine has worked for the Chinese National Fishing Corporation as a salesman for the last 15 years. A year ago, he called me. They have a huge office in New York. Not a lot of people know this. They're one of the biggest players on the U.S. seafood market, buyers and sellers. A year ago, they fired all their salespeople. Every single salesperson. All they have is buyers now. That sent a shockwave through the seafood industry. The phones were buzzing. Everybody was calling each other. What's going on? You know, is there some... Nobody really understood what was going on. It was very simple. They're not in the selling business anymore. They're in the buying business because they need more seafood. And it's being driven by the changes in consumption and affluence, as we've heard earlier. This is, just very briefly, we've talked about a lot of this, but this, I think, is the most important thing to look at. Look at the mix of species currently in the world between freshwater and saltwater and brackish. Interestingly, you're culturing the highest number of species in probably one of the most limited resources. So if you look at the research community, at least in the US and particularly in the EU, there's a lot more research on saltwater species than there is freshwater species because of the fact that if you look at potential for expansion and significant ramping up, that's probably where the potential is. How many people know in the United States, everybody familiar with the term the EEZ, Exclusive Economic Zone? Which would you guess is bigger, the EEZ or our landmass? We have more water than we got land in this country. And so, does that mean that it's all going to be developed for farming or not? Probably not. There are tremendous challenges. But it means that there is a potential for expansion that is huge and isn't limited by freshwater or arable land. And that's the point, I think. These are some of the latest growth rates in the particular sectors within aquaculture. And the finfish guys get a lot of heat for environmental impact, but they're a relatively small portion on a tonnage basis of worldwide production. But look at the growth rates in some of these. These are in the last 5 years. What agricultural sector do you know that has those kind of growth rates on an annualized basis in the last 5 years? There are very few. Okay, I'm not going to belabor this. You've heard a lot of this. I will say this. In 2010, the National Security Agency every 5 years puts out a national security risk assessment. 2010, for the first time, seafood was identified as a national security risk. And it was identified as a national security risk for two very simple reasons. One, we import so much of it, and it contributes to our national trade deficit. And two, we inspect so little of it. And you were starting to see pings on the FDA inspection list. Everybody know you can go to the FDA website and look at inspection records and seizures. It's a fascinating thing to do. I would encourage you to do it when you're not doing something more important. But it's amazing to see what's coming up in terms of contamination and where it's coming from. The reason that U.S. seafood is so popular in China right now, what is it? Food safety. They would rather buy U.S. produced seafood than domestically grown seafood because they are suspicious of their own food safety and their own production. And we're getting I had a shellfish grower. My group represents both shellfish and finfish and aquatic plant growers. I had a shellfish grower call me 6 weeks ago and said, I just got this phone call. I want to talk to you and find out whether it's legit or not. I got a guy, he offered to buy everything I can grow for the next 3 years for 25% over the market price. Whatever the market price is, he'll give me a 25% premium, and he will give me a signed contract for everything I can grow. I said, this is a fraud, clearly. You say, don't believe this guy, right? So I said, give me the name of the company. I've been in the seafood business for 25 years. The seafood company is a legitimate company. It's a front for the Chinese National Fishing Company, and they were serious. They were absolutely serious. Now, whether or not it would have ever come to fruition or not, but that's the kind of stuff which is being talked about in the U.S. seafood industry right now. So this is U.S. production, and this is, I think, you've seen some of this, but I think the most interesting thing here is look at our makeup in terms of species and in terms of both numbers of species and the percentage between finfish and shellfish. So we are doing a lot more saltwater species prospecting, if you will, than is occurring in some other places in the world. The species breakdown is also interesting. We have a relatively low number of shellfish species that we're researching, a relatively high number of finfish species, and this species culture is both commercial and research. So it's not the commercial numbers would obviously be significantly different than that. This you heard Chris speak about this earlier. We are way behind in terms of growth rates. We have some bright spots, as Chris identified earlier, but we are way behind. And in fact, I believe, and there are a number of us who have kind of looked at this more recently, we think that we have been flat. Totally flat for the last probably 3 years, and maybe even contracting in some areas. So we are way behind the curve. This is data that I pulled out of some USDA and USDOC documents, but this is the percentage of seafood and aquaculture which is domestically produced versus other protein groups. Look, what is wrong with that picture? That is astounding. So, I'm going to end with 4 slides. One will be, 2 of them will be challenges, and then I'm going to propose some solutions and talk a little bit about perhaps some of the strengths we have in this country. I honestly, you hear a lot about, I'm a private sector guy, right? All my guys have to apply for permits. We got to compete with foreign imports. We have to make money. That's the name of the game for us. You would expect me to be the person up here complaining about regulations. I'm not going to do that. And the reason I'm not going to do that is because in the state that I work in, we have evolved to a point where we have a regulatory climate that works. Our regulations are issued nationally, and particularly the Lacey Act of regulations and the ESA, absolutely. And we have to find some practical common sense ways to deal with those regulatory challenges. But they are not, in my opinion, what is inhibiting aquaculture development in this country. And I think I want to make a slightly different case. We need a blue space program. We need something that is of national level, that articulates the urgency that we are facing in the country, and that maps out a way to solve that problem for this country in a way that gives people concrete action items and solutions. We have a complete and utter, in my opinion, both within the profession and even within some folks' agencies who are very supportive. We have a total lack of vision and leadership in this country. It's shocking to me that if you compare aquaculture to agriculture 100 years ago, we had national leaders 100 years ago saying agriculture is an area that we have to invest in as a nation. You don't get any of that discussion at a national level about aquaculture. This is on us. This is on my guys. Industry is fragmented around commodity groups. How many producer associations do we have in the U.S.? We've got a striped bass growers, a tilapia growers, we got a shellfish growers, we got a salmon, we got you name it, we've got it. This is just ridiculous. We need to come together and articulate and speak as one group. And yes, there will be times when our interests are divergent within that group, but it doesn't mean that we can't articulate and work together as a single group. And Betsy Hart, bless her soul, at NIAA has tried very hard to do that, but we have got to do better than we are doing now. I would argue that that's one of our biggest problems, challenges in the U.S. Lack of political will and leadership. I worked for 3 years, only 3 years, as a public servant for a state management agency. One of the things I learned is the difference that public servants can make in terms of allowing a sector to grow. In the state of Maine, we went through a period where basically the state regulatory agency said, this is a priority. We need to grow this sector because if we don't, our working waterfronts are going to disappear. When that happened, you would be amazed the difference it made in permitting. Length of permitting time was halved. Investment was doubled. Production was doubled, all within a 4-year period. I mean, so it's a lot about the message that you're sending to the investor community. I don't know how many people really understand investor confidence. Investor confidence is probably the single most important thing in terms of stimulating economic development. And it's not just a bunch of numbers on a paper and a spreadsheet about what your return on investment is. It's what confidence do I have as an investor that my investment isn't going to go up in smoke because some Poindexter in some room is going to pass a law which is going to make it impossible for me to make a living. There are a lot of things that go into investor confidence, and political will and leadership is a big part of it. If you have a governor that stands up, and we saw this in Maine, we had a governor that said, this is one of my 3 priorities, and I'm going to, over the next session, I'm going to make it a priority. We're going to put in economic development plans. We're going to put in, that's the kind of thing that sends a message. We then started to attract capital, not only from the rest of the United States, but from Europe and from Asia. The social license to farm, this is something which, unless you're operating in public waters, it may or may not be important, but it is difficult to get the licenses. You have to do your community work. Lack of economic development incentives. When I spent 12 years of my career in Scandinavia and built, as a result of that, projects all around the world for Scandinavian investors. I would go to a place like Ireland, walk into a room like this, and 2 things became clear very quickly. One was, there was a guy in the room who had a check for me, and it was 50% of my initial capital investment. A check, not a loan, not a loan guarantee, cash. You want to start a company in my country, I want you to come here, we're going to give you something to start that company with. It's unheard of in the United States. The other phenomenon that was very different between the U.S. and those countries was how many people are in this room? We got maybe 12, 15 people. Okay, 11 of you would have been here asking me what you can do to help me start my business. And one of you would have been in the room saying, but oh, by the way, you have to comply with these regulations. In the United States, it is exactly the inverse. I got 12 guys in the room telling me, first word out of their mouth, no. Second word out of their mouth, no. I mean, just look at NOAA fisheries. For those of you who work
That's
at
why
Marine,
it says NOAA.
NOAA Fisheries has about 3,000 employees. Over half of NOAA Fisheries employees are dedicated to protected resources and endangered species. That is an agency which was, in its original inception, was founded to develop the commercial fisheries of the United States of America. So there are some problems with our lack of economic development incentives and programs. Crop insurance and risk management. We in aquaculture can only access very few of the traditional USDA crop insurance or risk management tools. That's a huge problem for us, because what is your largest asset on the farm? It's your swimming inventory. It's your aquatic plants. By far, the largest value of any piece of your business is it's not the processing plant, it's not the land you're growing on or the marina that you're working out of. It is the value of the fish or the plants and animals that you are growing. Without some form of crop insurance or risk management, that is at risk. And when you're talking about production cycles, what's the production cycle for corn in the United States right now, roughly?
6 months.
6 months. Production cycle for poultry, we heard it earlier.
42 days.
Production cycle for the average finfish?
18 months. 18 to 24.
It's like 18 to 24 months at least. Same with shellfish, it might be as long as 36 months. So you've got a much longer production cycle with a high level of risk and no risk bet hedging tools, or very few. We have a few, but they're not a lot of them. Federal agency conflicts. I harp on this every time. You've got, at least in the marine aquaculture world, you have 3 federal agencies which are all competing with each other for jurisdiction. It's ridiculous. I don't mean to insult anybody in the room, but when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, and USDA signed the Animal Health Memorandum, what did they agree to do? They all agreed to keep on doing what they were doing. Instead of streamlining it, we ended up with 3 agencies all saying they were doing the same thing. It effectively had little or no impact on
There's
those.
the Army Corps of Engineers.
You have you've got the Army Corps of Engineers too. You also have, there's a lot of agencies involved. And obviously, even though my spelling is horrible, lack of therapeutics is a big issue for us. We have, and you guys know this better than I do, but we have basically 5 tools we can use, one of which is salt and one of which is oxygen. It's ridiculous what we have compared to terrestrial agricultural production. So, I don't think I'm going to... The only thing I want to say here is, on the marine side of things, I believe that we need to refocus our research and extension priorities. A lot of the folks that I deal with in research and extension, and I mean no offense to the Sea Grant folks in the world, but in the Sea Grant world, Sea Grant, in my view, has really lost its roots. And it's really focused on recreational use, and it's not focused on commercial production. And it's very conflicted about being an advocate versus being a neutral party. That's not really helping us. It isn't. We're not getting a whole hell of a lot out of that. National ocean policy. How many people even know that we have a national ocean policy? Does anybody know that the Obama administration, by executive order, didn't go through Congress, issued a national ocean policy? It goes all the way to the high tide mark, and it has some very, very significant policy precedents in it. It's now being rolled out on a regional basis. This is one that I tell my guys is huge for us. It's going to have some huge implications for whether or not we can do business. Okay. Challenges, equal opportunity, equal choices. I'm not going to read this. My point really here is the underlying fundamentals, the things which are driving the need for aquaculture, are good. They're huge. They're in our favor. We need to take advantage of those, and we need to start to deliver at a national level. How do we do that? some of this is pie in the sky stuff and maybe completely naive on my point. I think we need to resolve the conflict between the federal agencies. Frankly, from my point of view, we need to say that USDA is the lead agency on aquaculture development in the United States of America, and that there are other agencies that have a role to play, but USDA needs to be the mother agency, if you will, that other stuff is fed into. I would like to see, and for those of you who track legislation, you know that at the last minute, at 11 o'clock at night, we lost in the last Farm Bill the specialty crop designation for aquaculture. That would have made a huge difference for us domestically in terms of the programs we qualify for. We need to get aquaculture defined as a specialty crop at the next Farm Bill, and we need to make sure that we don't lose it as part of some backdoor trading piece at the last minute. I would like to see a national aquaculture development program. Notice I don't say research and development program. I mean, we're doing good stuff in research. Yes, we have limited resources, but I think, frankly, under the leadership of Jeff and Gary Jensen and some of the folks at NOAA Fisheries, we've got a better working together than we've had in many, many years, and the research is really producing some pretty impressive results. But that's not what I'm asking about. I'm saying we need to do what Norway did. We need to do what Japan did. We need to do what China is doing now, which is they are creating national development programs. And there are very clear pieces to that program. It's actually, if you look at it, it's not all that different than what we did with agriculture 100 years ago. It really isn't. You need a national training program. Our academic system now is producing academics. It is not producing farmers. When you go through, I have 2 degrees. When I went through my degrees, I was being trained as a fisheries biologist, and then when you go to your master's, you're being trained as an agricultural economist, and the next step for you is a PhD and going into academia. Those are not farmers. We are not training farmers. We need a national training program that acknowledges how multidisciplinary aquaculture is, and trains farmers with a broad set of skills, including business and farm management skills, not just biology, not just engineering. We need regional demonstration farms. I was lucky enough at the beginning of my career to work at one of the regional demonstration farms in Norway. When I first went to work, we had 3 demonstration farms in the country. We had less than 100 farms. When I left 12 years later, we had over 700 farms, and virtually all of the farmers that had started those companies have been trained at the regional demonstration farms. And those regional demonstration farms were also often associated with regional breeding stations and hatcheries that provided juveniles to the startup farmers. We've got to get past this. We're a third world country in aquaculture, folks. We need to think about it in terms of rural development. Tax incentive, risk management tools, startup capital and financing, and finally, consumer education and marketing. We need to get our message out better to the consumers. How do you fund something like this? Anybody have any question?
Yeah. Quite easily. Full of partnerships.
I'm talking cash, not in kind. The in-kind thing doesn't work for me. People do the in-kind game all the time.
No, I would say cash.
Okay.
And it comes from government and private investment.
For me as a private investor, I can invest in Chile and make a whole hell of a lot of money. Why would I invest in the United States?
That's where part of the investment for the government comes.
So what I would say simply is we have actually some funding mechanisms out there, and there are 2 of them. One is, some of you I'm sure are familiar with the Salt and Kennedy funds. There's a debate right now about some of those funds being reprogrammed into national seafood marketing. We don't need to market seafood nationally. This is ridiculous. We don't need, everything we produce, we sell, and we sell at a premium in this country. We do not need to market U.S. seafood. What we need to do is take the 80% of Salt and Kennedy funds, which go into the general fund, and refocus them into a national aquaculture development program. And the other piece that's out there, which is very controversial, but I sincerely think this is an important piece. There is my congressperson, Shelley Pingree, has submitted a National Working Waterfronts bill. And what's not in the bill yet, but you will probably see, is a proposal for any state that has an excise tax on real estate transfers. If that piece of real estate touches the water, a portion of that real estate excise tax should go to a working waterfront development fund. That is a very controversial proposal and will generate a lot of pushback. But the amount of money involved is enormous. And you could end up with $1 billion program just based on that one funding source itself.